This time it looks like Lula is really going to jail. Brazil's charismatic former president will only be able to exhaust appeals against a corruption conviction from behind bars. Does the heavy favorite for the next presidential poll in October deserve it? Was justice blind? Supporters of the Workers' Party leader call the 6-5 decision by the court political. The destiny of the trade unionist come president, mirroring, you could say, the boom-to-bust story of Brazil these past 2 decades. Now it's anyone's guess how a polarized democracy will weather the latest storm, from an Operation Car Wash scandal that's now forced out scores of other politicians. And if you look beyond Brazil's borders, scalps in a growing number of Latin American nations, including most recently the president of Peru. Who is going to fill the void? A more accountable generation of leaders, or populists who will spin self-serving narratives? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Lula's, or the order that Lula be sent to prison. With us from Washington, Paulo Sotero, director of the Brazil Institute at the Wilson Center. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
From the University of Sao Paulo, Gabriela Pellegrino Soares, who teaches Latin American history this semester at Paris's Sorbonne Nouvelle University.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
From London, Alfredo Saad Filo, who teaches political economy at SOAS, the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And from Chicago, we welcome back Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management's Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez. How are you?
Good. Thank you, Francois. Always a lot of fun to be on the show.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. It'll probably be another 5 days of legal wrangling before the 72-year-old Lula has to turn himself in. But there will be more appeals, more uncertainty, and as Solange Mougin reports, certainly no closure in Brazil's court of public opinion.
A polarizing figure. Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva, who's known as Lula, is either loved or despised. For his supporters, many of whom hail from lower-income backgrounds, Lula is a defender of democracy in a country with a long history of military dictatorships and coups.
We're really worried for the future of our democracy in a country that is democratically fragile, a country that has suffered coups against its institutions.
Lula's supporters have seen the corruption scandal as an attempt to keep the country's first working-class president from returning to power. Nationwide, he remains Brazil's most popular politician and the frontrunner in polls to become president again. But the Supreme Court's 6-5 decision against delaying a prison term for corruption is likely to end the 72-year-old's political career. Over the past days, anti-Lula protesters have also filled the streets. Many hail from the middle and upper classes, among them supporters of the center and the right. For them, this is about clearing out corrupt politicians, regardless of their political affiliation.
The population is protesting for justice. Brazilians are sick of violence, of so much impunity. We want to change this in Brazil.
A victory or a blow, the Lula decision further splits the country along its social divides, between the left and the right, between Lula's friends and foes, between the haves and have-nots. Rifts that very well may sway the presidential election in the fall.
Gabriela Pellegrino Soares, when you hear that protester saying Brazilians are sick of impunity, what's your reaction?
Well, I would say there are so many cases of horrible corruption, but we don't hear people really crying against other politicians. So I think the matter here is not corruption itself, but it is really an opposition to the Labour Party and to Lula himself that comes all along our recent history, and now they had the chance to really be in the streets and present their positions, but it is a way of really preventing Lula from being in the political scenery of the country, rather than the problem of corruption itself.
Paulo Sotero, you agree that justice is one-sided?
Depends on what happens next. A decision that targets only President Lula would be seen as Gabriela just described. It remains to be seen whether the judiciary system in Brazil will charge the many politicians associated, people of the right, of the conservative side, of companies in Brazil that were in bed with parties like the Workers' Party and their operatives in corruption activities. It would be obviously welcome for institutions' sake that the cases against these people, including elected officials of conservative parties, allied once to President Lula, to President Dilma Rousseff, today allied with President Temer, also face justice, face trial, because the impression would be, if that doesn't happen, that the rule of law is applied selectively.
And in the case of Lula, does the punishment fit the crime?
I believe in terms of the jail sentence, this has been considered by a lower court, by an appeals court. It's still under review. Personally, having known Lula, having once been his driver in Washington 37 years ago, I believe that given the symbolic nature of his presence in Brazilian politics, there are ways of maintaining the sentence he was convicted with, he was charged with, but maybe not sending him to a jail sentence in a penitentiary. The Brazilians are very creative on that, and the law allows, for instance, for the president to serve at least part of his sentence at home. It happens all the time. So it remains to be seen now. The idea that Lula will go to jail as a definitive, I think it's too early to tell. There is, as you mentioned, appeals to be heard, and we will see this this month, maybe next month, and the courts will decide.
Operation Car Wash, Alfredo Saad Filo, it's impacted politicians from across the political spectrum, and you've had politicians from all sides, such as the Speaker of Parliament, who've been forced out over this scandal. Is it unfair to say that this is vindictive justice?
This is vindictive justice. This is a lawfare, the use of justice to persecute individuals in the name of a political program. Brazil has been the victim of a coup that has put in power an extraordinarily daring gang of thieves. The accusations, backed up by proof, against President Temer and his intimate circle are absolutely incontrovertible. And in contrast, Lula is probably, very likely, going to jail on the basis of no crime at all.
But Congress is investigating President Temer.
Sorry?
Congress is investigating President Temer.
Congress has already declined to persecute President Temer twice. It may well decide to persecute him or to charge him the next time an accusation comes before Congress. But it is striking that Temer and his circle have so far escaped any meaningful punishment when Dilma Rousseff was removed from power on the basis of no crime at all, and Lula is going to jail on the basis, again, of no proven crime at all. It is absolutely scandalous that you read in the sentence that this is the sentence is passed for indeterminate acts. It is a scandal against democracy, and it violates the presumption of innocence. Besides, the application of justice is absolutely biased in this case. It is a political project, no doubt about that. A political project not to remove a corrupt politician from power, but a political project to remove a party from power, to remove a program of government from power. And it has succeeded in the coup of 2016. Now, this is in a democracy, you remove a program from power, you remove a party from power through elections. But after 4 consecutive defeats, the political right decided to try something else.
Daniel, let me bring in Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez on this. Daniel, do you agree that the ouster of Lula's successor, who hails from the same Workers' Party, Dilma Rousseff, was a political coup?
I think the removal of any president is going to have a political aspect, certainly. There's troubling, I think, particularly among the left in Latin America, to view any removal of any Latin American leader for whatever the reason may be it via impeachment, be it via a recall referendum, be it via some kind of criminal act, as a coup. I don't see anybody making the rounds among the what's left of the Latin American left to defend the recently removed president of Peru because he was of the wrong ideology. There is, I think, a structural issue at work here, certainly, in which Latin America is a part of the world where
all right, we seem to have
approving.
We're having Skype issues with Chicago. We're going to try to have those. We're going to try to have those Skype issues with Chicago fixed as soon as possible. Just a reminder for our viewers that the trouble all started in 2014 when federal police in Brazil uncover a mass corruption scheme dubbed Operation Car Wash, nearly $4 billion worth, siphoned from state coffers. At the heart of it, Brazilian construction giant Odebrecht, which for years had been running a graft scheme out of Geneva. We could show you a map that gives the Latin American countries that are tainted. There are more, by the way, than just in Latin America. There's also countries like in Angola. It's hit in places like Mexico, Chile, Argentina. And, of course, as Daniel was mentioning, the latest scalp, the president of Peru, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, and it's hit politicians. Again, I want to emphasize this point, Gabriela Pellegrino Suarez, from all sides of the political spectrum. Calling it a coup, you're the historian here. Is this really a coup?
Yes, I think the word is appropriate.
Because usually a coup involves soldiers and the forcible...
But maybe the soft power is also so efficient, no? Because I think there's one dimension which is the political and juridical process itself, which is full of flaws. The juridical issues concerning Lula are all the time being verified by specialists as full of juridical flaws. This is one dimension. But I think the word coup is appropriate because just after President Dilma has been overthrown, policies started to be implemented in Brazil, which represented exactly the opposite, that the working party that had been elected to govern Brazil had sustained.
All right, so implementing austerity policies, for you, they don't have a mandate to do it, that's undemocratic, but is it a coup?
Not only austerity policies, I would say, but it is more than that. It is concerning privatization of natural resources, concerning privatization of important public enterprises, those which are not yet being privatized, but already being very much fragilized, like Petrobras itself. I would say there are big economic issues that are being now affected.
So it's a conspiracy?
I wouldn't say it's a conspiracy, but I would say it's a way of opening possibilities that previously were being somehow protected by a government that had a national political project.
Paulo Sotero, you agree?
Not really. I think that President Dilma Rousseff was impeached because basically, let's be practical, under her government, the economy of Brazil was running to the ground. There is a major problem of fiscal imbalances that made more serious by her, including by subsidies that her government gave to major Brazilian companies to capitalists in Brazil that the Treasury could not support. Things went wrong. I think it's very simplistic to say this is only a coup. Yes, it doesn't look good. There is a problem of legitimacy in the current government, but some of the policies, or most of the important policies that are being implemented now, were proposed by Dilma Rousseff herself in her inaugural speech in her second round, their second government, second inauguration, I mean, starting with pension reform. Dilma Rousseff is on the record saying that pension reform is absolutely necessary in Brazil to keep the fiscal balance, and she was unable, she was incapable of moving this through Congress. She was caught in this process that ended with her in her impeachment. I think the people not sympathizing with the current government, and I agree with whoever says that the current government lacks legitimacy, is populated by some very suspicious characters. But the question here is whether Brazil moves on, elects a president that is responsible, knowledgeable, capable of bringing the nation together. There is a possibility that will happen, and let's wait and see. Elections in Brazil will take place
in October,
on October 7.
We're going to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
Down to Earth, presented by Florence Villemino.
The Arctic is going to be exploited, and the scale of this exploitation will only grow.
We have a beautiful planet, we need to protect it, and we can use space exploration to better understand it.
Now we've moved from, is that real, to what do we do about it?
Join us on Down to Earth, where we explore the incredibly complex relationship between humans and our planet. We're here to ask the tough questions and find answers that may just surprise you.
Down to Earth on France 24 and France24.com.
Here in Paris, we are the early birds.
You mean the nighttime owls? We're up at 2 a.m, ready to be on air at 6.
But it is the breakfast slot here in Europe, across Africa or the Middle East.
But what time of day is it where you are?
In India, it would be the morning or lunchtime.
In Far East, it's already the afternoon.
Meanwhile, across in Australia, it's already the early evening.
And on the west coast of the US, it's already late at night.
But wherever you are and at whatever time, we're bringing you the latest news, business updates, press reviews and analysis.
Making sure you're the best informed you can be, whatever time of day.
Live from Paris. New format on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. A German court agreeing to release on bail Catalonia's former president, separatist leader Carles Puigdemont. His extradition request to Spain is being examined by that German court. UK authorities say Yulia Skripal's been told of Russia's offer of consular assistance, but has yet to take it up. Earlier, the Russian ambassador pressed for access to Skripal, who's in hospital with her father, a former spy, this after being poisoned last month. Italy's president meets party leaders to see which one, if any, can form a government. The head of the biggest vote-getter, the Five-Star Movement, and Silva Berlusconi both make clear they won't be in a coalition together. The UK's equality watchdog threatens legal action against the 1,500 firms who've so far failed to meet a deadline for publishing gender pay gap statistics. 80% of those that did file pay men more than women. We'll have more in business with Kate Moody. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at what's next for Brazilian politics after the Supreme Court ordered the country's charismatic former president, who was the frontrunner for next October's presidential poll, Lula, Inacio da Silva, to go to jail, to start serving his 12-year prison term for corruption, where he'll be appealing against charges. From Washington, Paulo Sotero, director of the Brazil Institute at the Wilson Center. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Gabriela Pellegrino Suarez, teaching this semester at the University of Paris Sorbonne Nouvelle. Alfredo Saad Filo teaches political economy at SOAS, the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, and from the University of Chicago's Kellogg School of Management, Daniel Landsberg joins us. Daniel, just before the break, you were looking again. It seems as though this Operation Car Wash, the Odebrecht scandal, a couple of weeks, 3 weeks ago, it was the president of Peru resigning. Now it's Lula being forced to jail. It just keeps on going.
That's absolutely right. And essentially, Latin America is entering a very particular moment in its relationship with corruption, which has long been a problem within the region. And basically, different countries are taking various strategies and approaches in trying to handle this issue. I would argue that, for example, Guatemala, which has more presidents or ex-presidents in jail than out of jail, has essentially outsourced its entire judicial corruption system to the UN, which has been very controversial, as it would be for any country. In other countries like Colombia, for example, you have a judiciary that largely goes after the side that's not in power. Then you have sort of the Mexican strategy, which is to be as corrupt as you want and hope nobody notices. And Brazil is sort of embarking, and I would argue it's the spearhead of what you have as sort of a crusading judiciary that goes after all sides. Lula is a household name, certainly, that is currently being targeted, that has been found guilty and had been found guilty once more and actually had the sentence strengthened, prolonged on appeal. But at the same time, you have Cunha, who, as you mentioned previously, the former Speaker of the House, who is in jail. You have Renan Calqueiros, who was alongside Cunha, probably the most powerful person in the legislature for a long time, who has been ousted and is going through a lengthy set of appeals. The government in power has what we would call elsewhere in Latin America a rabo de paja. There is a lot of skeletons in the closets as well, and the judiciary is going after them. That said, there is an extent to which the problem in Brazil is systemic. You have a legislature which has 40 parties, where nobody can ever actually dominate without getting a lot of other parties than their own on board. And the ways that that has managed to be done since Lula came to power, starting with the verge scandal, was through graft. Graft was, for a long time, the lubricant that allowed governance to somewhat function in Brazil and produced what was really a good time from a governance standpoint, from growth for many of the people who were the rising middle class. But at the same time, a lot of institutional violations and corruption took place to make that happen. And if we ignore that after the fact, or slough it all off as politics, we do a disservice to a country in which the people are speaking with one voice that they're sick of corruption and they want a change.
All right, that graft, as you say, affecting all sides. And it brings us to the question that Paulo Sotero had raised just before the break, which is, how will it impact that presidential vote in October? If Lula can't run, one of the contenders from his Workers' Party could be Bahia Governor Jacques Wagner. But he's got issues of his own, particularly the building of that cable car from his building to the beach below. That leaves Jair Bolsonaro as the early favorite. The MP for Rio leads what's called the Social Liberal Party, but the former army officer is branded as far right. Bolsonaro has sometimes even been called the subtropical Trump for his defense of torture, former junta leaders, and corporal punishment for children who show homosexual tendencies. if there is this feeling that everybody's corrupt, what kind of a presidential election are we going to have, Gabriela Pellegrino Suarez?
Yes, I think this is the problem when we limit democracy, because there is space for anything, and democracy is being limited in Brazil right now. So all the conservative forces and sometimes the authoritarian and even violent forces can appear and somehow fulfill this space that has been opened.
But as you heard Daniel Landsberg say, there is this crusading judiciary going after all sides.
Yes, yes. But I think this is the problem of saying, well, we will move on and organize new elections, but you say there's someone that cannot be a candidate. And this kind of expectancy that there will be a responsible president that will save and find the solution for our problems, this is an illusion. It will not happen. So I think the most important is that we are sure that democratic institutions and democratic atmosphere should be respected, and it hasn't been.
Alfredo Saad Filho, the best selling point of Bolsonaro is that he's not tainted by Operation Car Wash. Can Brazil do better? Are there not other new leaders that can come up?
Bolsonaro, just to make it clear, is a Nazi. He should not be supported or considered a valid presidential candidate in the sense that his political program is unacceptable and contrary to the Constitution. Now, that's to one side. The paradox that the coup has created in Brazil is that it was strong enough, the right was strong enough to remove an elected president, but the right is not strong enough to have a viable presidential candidate. And this is an incredible situation. It's a movement with no individual figures that can lead it. So Temer has extremely low popularity levels, between 3 and 5%. All the potential candidates aligned with the right have extremly low numbers, and Bolsonaro has emerged.
But does the left have the same problem? Because there's nobody prominent so far who's emerged and who's not tainted, it seems.
Precisely. This is a problem. It's a country with a political system in disarray. And in this disarray, the military have come back into the political scene. We seem to be living again in the 1950s in Brazil, where the military can threaten the institutions and proclaim their right to judge what is correct and what is not correct and what are the parameters for the political debate. This is extremely dangerous. And in this sense, the coup has opened a Pandora's box that they can hardly control. But being extremely unpopular, this is the way they have found to maintain themselves in power. So Brazil is now entering uncharted territory in the sense of a profound instability in the political system and a constitution that is very, very difficult to maintain. It is not being maintained in the sense of protecting the rights or the civic rights of innocent people, or people who have not exhausted all their possible avenues of appeal. A constitution that is being applied selectively in the sense of military intervention in the state of Rio de Janeiro as an essay to try out and see what they can do to maintain order in the country as a whole and contain the far right.
So let me bring in Paulo Sotero on this. Paulo, do you agree that Brazil's democracy is under threat?
It's under stress. I think Brazilian democracy is under severe stress, but I am a believer that in its capacity to renew itself, to face this issue, I completely disagree with the idea that those decisions, actually the decision made yesterday by the Supreme Court was actually 5 of the 6 judges that voted to deny a habeas corpus to President Lula were nominated to the Supreme Court by Lula and by his successor, Dilma Rousseff. It's not correct to say that a party has been removed from the process. A candidate, potential candidate, has been removed, President Lula, as a consequence of a law that he signed into law in 2010 that makes convicted criminals ineligible for office. So, and the PT has now the possibility of presenting another candidate, Jacques Wagner, that you mentioned, also the former mayor of São Paulo, a colleague of Gabriela at the University of São Paulo, a very able politician, honest man, actually good friends with former President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, a depolarizing figure in the PT, and I think what's going to happen as a consequence of the decision yesterday and the fact that Lula is not going to be able to present himself as a candidate is that the campaign will be depolarized. With Lula not in the picture, the appeal of a Bolsonaro who is correctly described by some in this program as an apologist of rape, of torture, of racism, his appeal diminishes. I believe the way forward now, based on the facts, is probably opening up more room for centrist candidates. And here there are two. The current governor of São Paulo, polling in very low numbers right now, but elected 4 times to the governorship of the largest state in Brazil, and former Chief Justice Joaquim Barbosa, the first black man nominated by President Lula to the Supreme Court of Brazil. As Chief Justice, he presided over the corruption scandal that preceded Lava Jato, and he could emerge, not Bolsonaro. Joaquim Barbosa has probably better chances emerging as the outsider candidate. He is very
now that Lula's out of the picture. A lot of reactions coming in on the hashtag F24 debate. Let's just read one. Be careful of the news you pick up. I've read a lot about this judgment. Sadly, I must say, don't mix what Lula did for Brazilians and what he did in his private life, and worse, even what the party did for building alliances and power. There's still an aura around the person of Lula, and is he going to go away quietly now, or is he going to want to play kingmaker, and is he going to weigh how heavily is he going to weigh on that October poll, presuming, of course, that he doesn't that he's unable to run for president? Is his power going to diminish, or is he still going to loom larger than life in this?
I believe it's a matter really of a serious political conflict. So I think he will put pressure on it all the time, not as a king, it's not how I see him, but someone who is ready to resist to an attack that has been made by many forms, especially by the press. The press has been very disrespectful towards him in the late 2-3 years. So I believe it's a matter of a political conflict. I think at the end he won't be able to run, and if he's not able to run, he won't run, because he has always acted within democratic limits. So I think he will keep on like that and will not be a candidate at the end of the day. But of course, he's building a structure so that the party can go beyond him. And I think that is what matters now. And he's active. It is a matter of resistance, and I think if there is an aura around Lula, from my very youth, I was involved with the building of the Labour Party in Brazil. I think if there is this aura, is because there has been an important change in what is a serious matter in Brazil: social inequity. I am not in favor of all that has happened throughout this period, the government of Lula and then Dilma Rousseff. I had many criticism towards these two governments, but it is true that it was a landmark in our history in terms of tackling social inequity. And this is something big. This is why I think he got to a point that no one before him could get. And this has a value. This is why things are so polarized at the moment.
Things are so polarized at the moment. The Lula years, when he was in power, were also years of economic boom. The start of Operation Car Wash in 2014 compounded the economic pain of Brazil, a nation bogged down by its worst recession now in a recent memory. Have all the gains, Daniel Landsberg, not just the economic ones, but also the social gains, do they stand the threat of being erased when you look at the graph on Brazil's recession?
Well, Brazil's middle class, which was the driver of its burgeoning economy, you had the largest oil find in the country's history early on in Lula's tenure. You had the rise in oil prices from below where they are today into the mid-triple digits during Lula's tenure. A lot of money came in. And a lot of that went to social programs, as it did in many other areas and many other countries in the region. A region where, since colonial times, the role of both church and state, to a certain extent, has been taken by the states in providing education, providing healthcare. That said, the political forces, what allowed for that to happen, were built with feet of clay, essentially. It was a large, essentially an all-you-can-graft buffet that allowed the wheels of Brazil's very problematic legislative institutions to actually get anything done. And in a sense, for a country that always seems to be on the cusp of success, that always seems to be on the cusp of rising to global power and then has the rug pulled out from under it, I think that the pain felt by Brazilians is greatly compounded, not just because they weren't given a candy, but because it appeared that they were going to be given a candy and then it got snatched away, which is something that always seems to happen to them.
Yeah,
I'd like to echo what many people have.
I was going to say,
I'd like to echo what many people.
Go ahead, just finish your point.
No, my point was the problem now is that because there's so much disenchantment with the system, with Brazil, with what came before, that we do have outsider risk from folks like Bolsonaro, which is very similar to what happened, for example, in Italy after the Monopolita scandal basically cleared out its entire political class. Which were being corrupt in various different ways, which helped funnel the rise of Berlusconi, who, although he was corrupt, managed to, through a web of alliances, stem the tide. What is happening now, I do not think that Bolsonaro will be the next president of Brazil. There's a second round. He may be the best contender in the first. But you can very easily see a moderate candidate like the ones that Paulo mentioned previously drawing support from the left. The left is going to be in a weak position. In part, it can appear from outside that the PT is being taken out of the election. But I would argue that that is not a consequence of what the courts have done. They have taken an individual out. That is a consequence of the fact that the PT as a party is famously top-heavy. Lula early on had certain lieutenants and Dalfans who would rise to prominence, but most of them, after the Mensalao scandal, ended up in jail or sidelined. Then he put a lot of time into. So
the PT will be weakened, is what you're saying. We're running short on time, and there's just one more point which I think is important. We've talked about the corruption scandals that are going to weigh on the campaign. We've talked about the economic pain that Brazilians are feeling that are going to weigh on the campaign. There's another question which has tragically been brought to the forefront in these past weeks. 3 weeks ago, the murder of Marielle Franco, the outspoken Rio City councilwoman. She was a tireless defender of the rights of slum dwellers from the favelas and the police brutality they endured. She was 37 years old. Will this be a factor in the campaign, speaking for those people in the favelas, Alfredo Saad Filho?
I hope it is. Now, Brazil is a violent country, and there's a lot of violence against activists, against landless peasants, and now against politicians. Now, Marielle was occupying a particular position. She was very prominent in looking into police violence in the favelas, and she was a woman, and that is very likely to have made her unacceptable to very powerful people, people who wanted her out of this particular picture. So it is tragic, but it's not out of character in a country that has been characterized by political violence and other forms of violence throughout its history. This is sadly a feature of Brazilian political life.